Tonight, a minute's silence is held across the UK in memory of the late Queen before her state funeral tomorrow. People came together to share a moment of reflection, remembering the country's longest reigning monarch. The US President Joe Biden was among those paying his respects at Westminster Hall, where the Queen is lying in state, and later he paid tribute to her.
Our hearts go out to the royal family, to King Charles and all the family. It's a loss that leaves a giant hole.
This is the scene now outside Westminster Hall as people wait patiently to be allowed in. The queue will close to the public in the early hours of tomorrow morning. Among the 2,000 invited guests at tomorrow's funeral at Westminster Abbey are members of the public who've been preparing for the solemn occasion.
Fairly choked up. Emotional is probably the main word, yeah. Honoured and emotional.
And tonight, King Charles has released a message of thanks to the countless people who've provided support and comfort in this time of grief. Also on the programme. In Ukraine, President Zelensky says he has more evidence of torture carried out by Russian forces in the east of the country. And act swiftly to save your lives. The urgent warning of Japan's Prime Minister to people living in the path of a huge typhoon making landfall in the south. Good evening. A minute's silence has been held across the country in memory of the late Queen on the eve of her state funeral in Westminster Abbey. Her son, King Charles, said in a statement tonight that he and his wife, the Queen Consort Camilla, were deeply touched by the many messages of condolence and support that they've received from this country and across the world. And that during their tour of the nations of the UK, they were moved beyond measure by everyone who came to pay their respects to his late mother. Members of the public are queuing for the final few hours in which they will be admitted to Westminster Hall to see the Queen's coffin lying in state. Among those who attended today was the US President Joe Biden, who is one of the many world leaders and dignitaries who've arrived for tomorrow's funeral. Here's our royal correspondent, Nicholas Witchell.
It is 10 days now since the news came of the Queen's death. The new King, Charles, arriving at Buckingham Palace earlier today with a wave to the crowds, has led the country's mourning in the days since. In a message tonight, he said he'd been deeply touched by the many messages from around the world. As we all prepare to say our last farewell, he wrote, I wanted simply to take this opportunity to say thank you to all those countless people who have been such a support and comfort to my family and myself in this time of grief. Among the hundreds of world leaders in London for the state funeral, the President of the United States. His motorcade arrived at the Palace of Westminster. A few moments later, President Biden and the First Lady of the United States, Dr. Jill Biden, stood quietly on a balcony inside Westminster Hall. Like so many thousands of others over the past 4 days, struck by the intensity of the scene.
I think what she gave is a sense of, maybe above all, the notion of service. We all owe something. There's something within our capacity to do that can make things, not just the world better, but your neighborhood better, your household better, your workplace better. To all the people of the United Kingdom, our hearts go out to you, and you were fortunate to have had her for 70 years. We all were. The world's better for her.
As the royal family prepares for the state funeral, from Camilla, the Queen Consort, her reflection on the 70 years of the Queen's reign.
She has been part of our lives forever. I'm 75 now, and I can't remember anybody except the Queen being there. It must have been so difficult for her being a solitary woman. There weren't women prime ministers or women presidents. She was the only one, so I think she carved her own role. I'll always remember that smile. You know, that smile is unforgettable.
Many thousands of people have wanted to be a part of this moment. Some have queued for many hours. or placed flowers in the designated spaces, or simply travelled to London to absorb the sights and the emotions along the route of the procession and outside the Abbey Church where the funeral will take place.
We didn't know what exactly to do, but we wanted to do something. You know, it felt right to come up and do something and bring my son here. And, you know, I think there's a lot of people that don't know what to do but feel like they need to do something. So it just felt like the right thing to do was to come up here with everybody else.
During the hours of darkness, the last visitors will be admitted to the lying in state at Westminster Hall. And then, in the morning, the state funeral will take place of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. Nicholas Witchell, BBC News.
Well, earlier this evening at 8 p.m, there was a minute's silence for a national moment of reflection. Across the UK, people came together to pause and to remember on the eve of the state funeral. Fergal Keane reports.
The flowers of the forest echoing across a Scottish mountainside. A lament for the fallen, played now in tribute to a queen. And then, on the cusp of silence, in Blackpool, the going down of lights. Then, out of silence, into the anthem celebrating a new monarch.
God save the King. God save our gracious King. Long live our noble King. God save the King. Send him victorious, happy and glorious, long to reign over us. God save the King.
Across the land it was a gathering of strangers for whom the Queen was the unifying symbol.
Just to pay respects to the Queen and just to mark the passing of an era.
I don't think we'll see the likes of our Queen again. You know, she's been such a role model for all our lives, really.
She was very important to me, and I'm starting to get emotional now because I remember the coronation. I'm old enough to remember King George VI and him dying, and the coronation. We had a little 12-inch television and all the neighbours came in to watch the coronation. So, yeah, she's been our Queen for a long time and she served us well.
The silence spoke of respect and affection on the eve of farewell. Fergal Keane, BBC News.
President Biden will be among around 2,000 other guests, including some 500 heads of state and foreign dignitaries who will attend the Queen's state funeral tomorrow. It will be one of the biggest gatherings of royalty and politicians hosted in the UK for decades. They've been paying their respects to the late Queen and signing the Book of Condolence all afternoon, as our diplomatic correspondent James Landale reports.
Some came by themselves in, well, some sort of style. Others came together, rather unusually, on a bus. But they were all here to honour the Queen at perhaps the biggest diplomatic wake seen for decades. There was the King and Queen of Spain. There was his exiled father, Juan Carlos. There was the President of France and his wife. Leaders from the Gulf. The King and Queen of Jordan. Hundreds of statesmen and women there to pay their respects and indulge perhaps in a little diplomacy. Others arrived round the back of the palace, prime ministers and presidents, all guests of the king and other members of the royal family at the formal state reception. On a day of frantic international engagement, the Princess of Wales even found time to meet the First Lady of Ukraine, Olena Zelenska. Earlier, Joe and Jill Biden had followed other heads of state and government in stopping off at Lancaster House to sign a book of condolence. A steady flow of the global great and sometimes good paying their respects on behalf of themselves and their countries.
I so wish eternal peace to her wonderful, generous spirit and, of course, every good wish to King Charles III.
On behalf of the government and people of Barbados, that I record my sincere sympathy to all of Great Britain and especially to the members of the royal family.
We appreciated very much her leadership of the Commonwealth, which saw a dramatic transformation from a nation of 8 countries when she went onto the throne to 56 at the time of her death.
Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you for your dedication. The people of Fiji will never forget you. Modimanda Pakalelai.
Many also came to see the lying in state, not queuing, of course, but joining the public to stand in silence and perhaps some awe before the coffin of a woman whose reign will outlast their own. And despite the opposition of some MPs and peers who've been sanctioned by Beijing, a delegation from China also came to Westminster Hall, including Vice President Wang Qishan, here on the right, who will attend the funeral tomorrow. One man who won't be coming to the Abbey tomorrow is Saudi Arabia's Crown Prince and de facto ruler, Mohammed bin Salman, who's been accused of involvement in the murder of a journalist, accusations he's denied. Several leaders, including Canada's Prime Minister, also dropped by Downing Street for what officials said were informal conversations with Liz Truss. Earlier, he paid his own tribute to the Queen.
I first met Her Majesty when I was 7 years old, and her presence throughout my life had been constant, inspiring, and graceful. As Prime Minister, I benefited from her counsel, her thoughtfulness, her curiosity, her sense of humour.
Tomorrow, the diplomacy will be put on hold as the leaders arrive at Westminster Abbey and the focus returns to the monarch they've come to mourn. James Landale, BBC News.
Let's join our correspondent Jonathan Blake, who's been following events inside Westminster Hall as members of the public and dignitaries have been paying their respects. Jonathan.
Rita, this scene has become somewhat familiar over the last few days, but for those entering Westminster Hall tonight, the sight of the Queen's coffin lying in state is no less captivating. The draw that so many have felt to come remains, even if after queuing for hours, the experience lasts only a few minutes. There is darkness outside, but within, a scene of colour, of grandeur, of mourning, a scene to match any played out in this ancient arena. Famous faces joined members of the public to pay their respects today. Kings and Queens of Europe, the US President Joe Biden, First Lady Jill, a Chinese delegation, controversy briefly brushed aside. But the sole focus remained the coffin of Queen Elizabeth II, resting on the catafalque, draped in a royal standard. The rhythm of this extraordinary scene continues unbroken. Bowed heads, tears wiped away, the changing of the guard. But tonight, a sense too that it's almost over. Those stepping out of Westminster Hall into the night know they'll be among the last as the lying in state enters its final hours.
Jonathan, thank you. The Metropolitan Police says that more than 10,000 officers and staff will be on duty in London tomorrow to oversee the state funeral. The security operation is the biggest in British history. Our Home Affairs correspondent Daniel Sanford has been watching the final preparations.
Tonight, there is an army of police officers in central London. Tomorrow, more than 10,000 will be working to protect the funeral. Every force in the UK is involved in what has been a national mobilisation. On the rooftops overlooking Westminster, armed officers with binoculars and telescopes were already watching this afternoon. Every lamppost and traffic light is being taken apart, searched for hidden explosive devices and carefully sealed again. Even officers patrolling the River Thames are on alert. And this is where it's all been run from, the Metropolitan Police's Special Operations Room. Here they'll be able to access every CCTV camera. They'll be able to communicate with officers at every step along the route. And then there'll be specialist desks for things like firearms and for handling real-time intelligence. But despite all the technology and the thousands of officers, police are asking people in the crowds tomorrow to be their eyes and ears.
Members of the public who are coming, please engage with the officers, because you will see things, you will hear things that police officers might not. And if there is anything that you see that you think is out of the ordinary, please speak to one of the police officers so we'll be able to respond and deal with it appropriately.
The biggest VIP protection operation the police have ever mounted in London is already up and running, with President Biden's motorcade shuttling between Westminster and the Palace, and the French President Emmanuel Macron coming to pay his respects to the Queen on foot. Tomorrow, all the heads of state will be in one place, an 800-year-old church with no permanent security perimeter. There have been bumps along the road, like when a rollerblader nearly ran into the King's convoy. Officers say the plan has been decades in development, and they should be able to keep everyone safe. Daniel Sanford, BBC News, Westminster.
The government has confirmed that the queue for the Queen's lying in state will be closed when it reaches full capacity. As you can see here, there is currently an 8-hour wait. The lying in state period ends at 6:30 tomorrow morning. Well, earlier today, people were asked not to set off to join the queue as their journey might end in disappointment. Hundreds of thousands of people have already visited Westminster Hall. Our special correspondent Lucy Manning reports.
It became a London landmark, a queue in length to match the Queen's long reign. Now the numbers are receding, moving towards the end of a perfect tribute. The last few rushing to make sure they are in it.
Martin Hopkins, 7 minutes before 8 p.m, joining the back of the queue. I was at home, I was doing some mental calculations, seeing where the end of the queue was, working out if I had enough time to get here, and I reckon I did, but even then I got a bit spooked and ran. I thought I would regret it for the rest of my life if I didn't come, and I tried to persuade the rest of the family. They thought I was mad, they thought I wouldn't make the back of the queue, but have I? I think I have.
Where there was despair, it brought hope. Where there was sadness, it brought joy.
Give me a little wave, give me a little wave.
The queue itself was a journey, not just in the steps people took.
I'm Emma, this is Esme, we're from Cornwall. We've been queuing about 11 hours.
My legs have been hurting.
It's been pretty hard, it's cold, we stopped for quite a long time.
Yeah.
We were going to give up, but we carried on. We got each other through it, didn't we?
So why didn't you give up, Esme?
Because the Queen would have wanted us to be resilient in ourselves and push ourselves to be the best we can.
You feel quite emotional about the whole journey you've done?
Yeah, there's a lot of reasons for coming, people we've lost, and seeing so many people here all united. We lost my gran during COVID, so didn't get the chance to say goodbye.
Emma kept turning back for a last look. Was it worth the very hard night?
Yeah, I think it was. It's just our final chance to pay our respects.
It meant a lot to you to be able to do that?
Yeah, I would be telling the people that aren't here anymore all about it. But it makes me closer to them. She's used to it.
We're Lucy and Jamie. We've been queuing for 12 hours and this is my second time doing this.
She came first with her parents, returning today with her husband. So the question is, why do it again?
That 5 minutes was so special, and It's almost not enough time to take it all in that I thought, well, you know, I'll go through it again. It'll be worth it. For me, it's kind of restored my faith in humanity quite a bit, because you just see all of these people who are coming together. You may come from different backgrounds, but we've all just got one thing in common today.
There was this something in the air in there that was just magnificent.
This queue is a phenomenon. It has helped sustain the royal family and given the nation a focus for its grief. The British people, just by turning up, by being here, have turned part of the national mourning into a celebration of the Queen's life. Millions of steps. Hundreds of thousands of people. All for one Queen. Lucy Manning, BBC News.
Well, in a moment we'll speak to Jim Reid, who's in Westminster for us. But first, our correspondent Chichi Uzundu is following the end of the queue, with the final people set to file past the Queen's coffin tomorrow morning. Chichi.
Indeed, Rita, you can see people behind me are starting to collect the last remaining wristbands that the Department of Culture, Media and Sport are handing out. But people are still trying to join the end of the queue, like Judith and Ian here. Why are you trying at this time of the evening to join the queue, and why didn't you join it earlier?
Well, we saw it sort of 15 hours, 11 hours and all that, and I don't think Judith could put up with me for 11 hours in a queue. We saw it was 7, so we've come up from Medway, so let's give it a try.
And do you think you're going to make it?
Well, if this interview doesn't go on for too long, possibly we will. Otherwise, my solicitor will be contacting you.
OK then, Ian. Well, I'm going to let you go because the end of the queue is actually stretching further back as more people continue to try and join it. We've already heard that some stewards are telling people that they're not guaranteed a wristband, and the wristband is what you need in order to be able to join the end of the queue to go and see the Queen lying in state. Back to you, Jim Reid.
Thanks very much, Chi. So some 10, 11 hours after those people you've been talking to, we end up here in Westminster Hall. These people flying behind us here, or moving behind us here, have just finished seeing the lying in state of the Queen. A long wait, obviously, for many of them. We can speak to a couple of people here who've just come through in the last 10 or 15 minutes. We've got Tracy Alexander from London and Mario Theobald also from London. And I understand that you two met on the tube this morning, Tracy.
Yes, we did. It was entirely by chance. And we were going by together.
And so, Marion, how have you found the whole experience?
Very calm inside and very quiet. Different to the atmosphere in the queue.
And Tracy, why did you want to come today? What was the motivation?
I wanted to say thank you, and it hasn't really seemed real that the Queen died, that we're in a new age, and it seemed sensible to do something about it rather than dwelling continually on something I couldn't quite grasp, and to pay my respects. And I have lots of friends and family who couldn't be here today, so I've come for all of them as well.
Well, go get some well-deserved rest. And Rita, this queue here will finish at 6:30 this morning before attention moves to Westminster Abbey opposite. Back to you in the studio.
Jim, thank you. Jim Reid there, and thank you too to Chi-Chi. The queues to see the Queen's coffin over the last few days have become a familiar sight and are likely to remain among the abiding images of this period of national mourning. So what does this say about Britain's attitude to the monarchy and people's desire to be part of a moment of historical change? Nick Robinson finds out.
It is the queue, like the Queen. No other words are needed. You were, it seemed at times, either in it or watching it. At the last count, 7.5 million people had tuned in to the live feed to watch an estimated 750,000 walk past the coffin. We've never seen anything like it before, we all said, except those old enough to remember that some had.
Through the night, the people wait, silent and patient. Their night's rest they give to the king.
What we're seeing is extraordinary. It isn't, though, new. In fact, it's a flawless replica of what happened 70 years ago when the Queen's father, King George VI, died and he lay in state. Britain has changed dramatically, of course. There are 17 million more of us. Our population is so much more diverse. Back then, there was just the one TV channel, in black and white.
Thank you.
For so many here, what matters is that, being here, being in the queue. In this era of selfies and emojis and online posts, it seems that what we've discovered is the advantages of being social without the media, because the queue for many people is as much about this journey as it is about the destination.
The night ends, the doors open, and into the Hall of Kings, the Great Hall of Westminster, passes the long, silent column.
So many people, but so little noise. The silence, not just the absence of the noises of our modern era, the clicking and beeping of mobile phones, not even the silence of an ancient cathedral. Thick, deep piled carpet on the stone floor absorbs almost every sound. Until that tap tap for the changing of the guard. Another signals the lowering of weapons. After a third tap tap, heads are bowed.
Of George VI, it will be written, "This was a king his people loved."
So little has changed since we last mourned the monarch, and yet so much has changed. Gone are the Sunday best suits, the ties and the hats, of course, but we are still mourning together. Not everybody, of course. There are some who are baffled by all of this. There are others who fear that the monarchy has remnants of empire, of hierarchy, of deference, of class. So what does explain the willingness of so many to queue for so long for so short a glimpse of a coffin? People in the queue feel they are not alone. They are not socially distanced. They're not behind a mask or a screen. They are together with strangers who share that desire simply to be together, to remember, to respect, and to be here, in the queue. Nick Robinson, BBC News.
And if you haven't been able to get to London but you want to pay your respects, the BBC is offering a continuous 24-hour view of the Queen's lying in state. The service is available on the BBC homepage, the BBC News website and app, the iPlayer, on BBC Parliament and the red button. To other news now, and in Ukraine, President Zelensky says investigations into possible Russian war crimes are continuing in the city of Izium, which was recently retaken from Russian forces. Bodies are being exhumed from a mass burial site on the edge of the city. Izium is one of several areas back in Ukrainian hands after significant territorial gains in recent days, although heavy fighting is still continuing. In a moment, we'll speak to Steve Rosenberg in Moscow, but first, here's our Ukraine correspondent, James Waterhouse, who's in Kiev for us. James.
Rita, since Ukraine forced Russia out for the first time since the invasion and retook territory which was taken, it now seems to be focusing on investigating what the invaders did and what Moscow is going to do next. In the case of the city of Izium, while bodies continue to be recovered from a mass grave, the latest claim from Kiev is that there's evidence has been uncovered which suggests that torture chambers were used by Russian troops. There are reports of people being tortured and a city being littered with mines. There has again today been heavy fighting in the Kharkiv region where Ukraine has enjoyed recent successes. But on the question of what Russia will look to do next, well, the thought from the UK Ministry of Defence is that it will look to strike more civilian targets in Ukraine while it is frustrated on the battlefield. But this is something Russia has done throughout this war. It has hit targets across this vast country to try and exert influence and undermine Ukrainian morale. But on that latter point, in his latest address, President Zelensky has said just because we have regained swathes of territory this does not mean there will be a lull. What Russia will hope is that the very speed of their retreat will force Ukraine to pause.
James, thank you. Well, one of Russia's most famous singers has publicly condemned the war in Ukraine. Alla Pugacheva said that she wanted to be declared a foreign agent in solidarity with her husband, who's another outspoken critic of the conflict. Our Russia editor Steve Rosenberg is in Moscow for us. And Steve, how significant is this intervention?
I think it is significant. Alla Pugacheva is more than just a pop star. She's a musical megastar, has been for decades, going right back to the 1970s and the Soviet Union. She is super popular, she is admired, she is adored, she is respected across Russia, and aside from her wonderful voice, when she has something to say, people tend to sit up and listen. The statement that she issued today was more than just a staunch defence of her husband. It was a stinging criticism, really, of what the Kremlin still calls its special military operations. Some strong language. For example, at one point she said, "Our lads," meaning Russian soldiers, "are dying for illusory aims that make our country a pariah and the lives of our citizens extremely difficult." Now, I reckon that language like that, coming from someone like that, someone as famous as Alla Pugacheva, is going to infuriate the Kremlin. So I expect that we'll see attempts to try to discredit Alla Pugacheva in the state media. But it's going to be fascinating to see whether her public criticism will affect public opinion here and spark more public opposition to the special operation. Now, you may remember recently several town councillors in Russia expressed public criticism of Vladimir Putin and called on him to resign. Today we hear the criticism from Alla Pugacheva. Is there a pattern here? I think it's too early to tell, but certainly the message from the Kremlin is, as far as they're concerned, everything is going according to plan.
Steve, thank you. Steve Rosenberg reporting there. Police and community leaders in Leicester have called for calm after street clashes in the east of the city last night and more protests this afternoon. 2 people were arrested yesterday after officers had to separate hundreds of mainly young men in 2 groups from Hindu and Muslim communities. It's the latest in a series of disturbances this weekend, which were initially started by a cricket match between India and Pakistan late last month. A 24-year-old man has been charged in connection with the stabbing of 2 police officers in central London on Friday. Mohammed Rahman is accused of attempted murder and causing grievous bodily harm with intent. One of the officers suffered what have been described as life-changing injuries. Another suffered neck wounds, but is expected to recover fully. The Prime Minister of Japan has urged people to move swiftly to save their lives as the country is hit by one of the most destructive typhoons in years. Fumio Kishida's warning comes as the authorities urgently advise 3 million people to leave their homes as a huge storm moves across the southern island of Kyushu. Our Tokyo correspondent Rupert Wingfield-Hayes reports.
Typhoon Nanmadol is a huge and angry storm, the like of which Japan has rarely, if ever, experienced before. All day it's been battering the southern island of Kyushu, with winds gusting to over 150 miles an hour. This satellite image shows the immense size of the typhoon, enveloping the whole of the island. For the first time ever, the Japanese government issued its highest level emergency alert for Kyushu, warning winds could be strong enough to bring down buildings. An even bigger threat is the vast amount of water that Nanmadol is carrying. As much as 500 millimetres of rain is expected to fall in less than 24 hours. Kyushu is very mountainous, and it's feared the water could unleash landslides and swollen rivers could burst their banks. So serious is the concern that Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida made this appeal for millions of people to head for evacuation centres before nightfall.
Do not go near dangerous areas. If you feel that you are in danger, do not hesitate to evacuate. Please take early action to save your lives. Evacuating at night is extremely dangerous.
Many thousands have heeded that call, but many more have not and have chosen to ride out the storm at home. River levels across Kyushu and southern Honshu are now rising fast and will peak in the next 12 hours. All it takes is one breach and a whole town can be inundated in minutes, giving those that have refused to evacuate no time to escape. Japanese people are used to dealing with typhoons, especially in Kyushu. But as the global climate changes, the data shows these sorts of megastorms are becoming more frequent, and defences that worked in the past may no longer be enough. Rupert Wingfield-Hayes, BBC News in Tokyo.
In the last few minutes, this new photograph of the late Queen has been released by Buckingham Palace. It was taken at Windsor Castle in May of this year. It comes ahead of her state funeral tomorrow, which will take place at 11 a.m. at Westminster Abbey. The Abbey's tenor bell will toll every minute for 96 minutes before the service to mark each of the years of the Queen's life. More details have been released about the service tomorrow, including that Prince George and Princess Charlotte will be among the members of the royal family who will walk behind the coffin as it enters the Abbey. The service will be conducted by Dr. David Hoyle, Dean of Westminster. Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, will give the prayer of commendation as well as other parts of the service. The churches of the 4 UK nations will be represented. Baroness Scotland, representing the Commonwealth, and the UK Prime Minister Liz Truss will give readings. After the funeral ceremony, the Queen's coffin will be taken in a procession to Wellington Arch at Hyde Park Corner. The King will lead members of the royal family walking in the procession. The coffin will then be taken by state hearse to Windsor. At 4 p.m, there'll be a committal service in St George's Chapel in Windsor Castle with a small congregation. Here now is our Midlands correspondent Navtej Johal, who spent the day with 2 people who've been invited to attend the funeral.
As a volunteer emergency responder, Barbara is prepared for anything. She's so good at the job that she was informed that she was being awarded an MBE a few months ago. But she wasn't prepared for the call she received on Saturday last week.
Hello, is that Mrs. Barbara Ann Crellin? You tell me who you are, because it's no caller ID, and I'll tell you if I am. So, Cabinet Office. And then the next thing was, we'd like to invite you to the Queen's funeral. And I sort of filled up and I said, sorry, we'd like to invite you to the Queen's funeral. And I said, why me? I just didn't know what to think, what to say. I cried. I went and found my husband. I took him outside and I cried again. And he said, can I come? I said, no, there's no +1s.
The retired head teacher has spent more than a decade responding to 999 calls for the ambulance service as part of Rutland First Responders, a volunteer group trained to give life-saving treatment to their community.
How will you feel tomorrow when you're at the state funeral in London?
I should imagine fairly choked up. Emotional is probably the main word, yeah. Honoured and emotional.
Westminster Abbey, the state funeral of Queen Elizabeth II.
Much like Barbara, Kevin's life is focused on volunteering too. He organised thousands of people to give up their time to help others during the pandemic. He had no idea that he would end up being invited to the Queen's funeral.
A call on the landline, which of course you only get calls when someone's trying to scam you on the landline, but it was the Cabinet Office and just saying, oh, would you like to come to the Queen's funeral? And it just came completely out of the blue, very much like the honour came, and I was completely floored by it.
The volunteers that Kevin worked with did everything from delivering essential supplies to vulnerable people in his home city of Leicester to supporting the vaccination effort. He says he can't believe his work has now been recognised with an invitation to the funeral.
I don't think I can get over the fact that it's such an honour to be there representing the general British public, to be there to witness the funeral, and just to be part of it is just out of this world.
Barbara and Kevin are among around 200 people from the Queen's birthday honours list who have received an invitation. Members of the public who will bear witness to an historic event. Navtej Johal, BBC News.
Well, in just the last few moments, the queue for people waiting to pay their respects and file past the Queen's coffin lying in state has reached capacity and no more people are being allowed to join. Let's go back now to Lucy Manning, who's in Westminster for us with the waiting crowds. Lucy.
Well, the Department for Culture, Media and Sport have just put out a statement to say the queue for the Lying in State is now closed. Please do not attempt to join the queue. They say thank you for your understanding. For those still in the queue, and they are still coming through in massive numbers, that is absolutely fine. They can stay in the queue and people will be able to file past the Queen's coffin until the last half hour, the last few minutes. People were joining the back of the queue, taking that last minute decision to come through. And for 4.5 days, this has just been the most amazing spectacle. The queue has had a sense of community. Tonight, I've heard people cheering in the queue, singing in the queue, but that all changes when you get inside. There is that sense of respect, people standing with their own thoughts, and hundreds of thousands of people will have done that by 6:30 tomorrow morning.
Lucy, thank you very much, and apologies there for the sound problems. Well, also revealed in the last few minutes has been the order of service for the Queen's state funeral. Our royal correspondent Nicholas Witchell joins me now. Tell us more, Nick.
Yes, we have the order of service for the state funeral of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II. We can see the cover sheet there. And of course, all the details discussed with and approved by the Queen herself. A service of great solemnity and rich pageantry. And within Westminster Abbey, in the procession behind the coffin, the King, the Queen Consort, his two brothers and sister, the Prince and Princess of Wales, and as you mentioned, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, aged 9 and 7 respectively. It'll be the first time we've seen them since the Queen's death. No Prince Louis, though. Behind them, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. A service of about 1 hour in length, the address by the Archbishop of Canterbury. At the end of it, the last post will be sounded, there will be a 2-minute silence, and the muffled bells of the Abbey will be rung. And then at 4 o'clock, the committal service in St George's Chapel in Windsor, at the conclusion of which the instruments of state, the imperial great crown, the orb and the sceptre will be removed from the coffin and placed on the altar. The Lord Chamberlain will break his wand, his symbol of office. The coffin is lowered into the crypt. The Chief Herald, Garter, King of Arms, proclaims the styles and titles of Elizabeth II, and a piper will sound a lament.
Nick, thank you very much. The final route for the procession for the Queen's coffin will be down the Mall before continuing on to Windsor. Mourners and well-wishers hoping to get a prime position have been camping out there since Friday when the route was announced. Our correspondent Ashley John Baptiste has spent the day on the Mall and he joins me now from there. Ashley.
Well, Rita, I've been on the Mall for most of today, where people have come from far and wide to take part in this moment of national mourning. But right now, as the funeral looms and people settle down to camp overnight, the atmosphere is particularly poignant. There is a sense of both reflection, but also deep gratitude for the Queen. I've been speaking to people here. Setting up camp for the last goodbye. But still, some are struggling to come to terms with it all.
As soon as I heard the call from my mum, literally to say, have you heard the news? I didn't believe her for 1 minute and I put the news straight on, and straight away the emotions, I just sort of started to cry and just well up and just think I couldn't believe it.
I don't know what to say, it's just the emotion, isn't it? It starts to get to you, so yeah. I just...
On a day of mourning, some lighter moments.
On the news I saw Paddington and the Queen, and I thought I'll bring my little Paddington with me because I like cuddling it every night.
Supporters of the Queen, many from across the UK, have descended on the Mall. Paulette, who's camping overnight, made a solitary journey from Lincolnshire.
My son Michael, we normally come down for different things that here. We've been for the Jubilee and different bits. He's a wheelchair user, and because we knew it was going to be so busy, he couldn't come this time. So I said I'd come in his place and show support for my son, really. As you can see, he's a big royalist.
Others have come from further afield, like Blake.
So I came from Texas, and when the news came that she passed away, I was on a cruise, and I decided to pay a visit, and I flew in, and I landed this morning and came straight here.
Why?
Because the Queen has done so much for not only her reign, but the entire world.
For one family, 3 generations are represented today, a testament to the late Queen's impact.
I love the Queen. I really respect her.
Looking at the crowds and the people that are turning up, the camaraderie, and we've made new friends that have flown in from the States yesterday. It's just an amazing feeling, everyone just coming together. It's brilliant.
It's making history, so it means quite a lot. It's part of the new generation. I want to keep the legacy going.
As night fell, the atmosphere on the Mall was cheerful but subdued. The growing crowds observed the minute's silence as a mark of respect. A glimpse of the new king and a sense of camaraderie, helping people cope with their sense of loss. Ashley Jean-Baptiste, BBC News.
The Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, has spoken of his hope that the state funeral tomorrow will bind people more together. The funeral will reflect the Queen's deeply held Christian beliefs. Our religion editor Aleem Makboul has been looking at what religion meant to the Queen and the role it played during her reign.
Throughout her reign, in good times and bad, the Queen drew heavily from her faith to guide her. And this little church on the edges of the Balmoral estate was a place she held dear. She came to services at Crathy Kirk all her life, with very little ceremony, though there was a royal seat on a royal pew where she always sat.
The Queen was a very regular churchgoer. If she was here, almost always would come to church.
For 15 years, Ken Mackenzie was domestic chaplain to the Queen. And he'll be among those at Windsor for her final service.
Some of the moments I would cherish most would be moments when the Queen would speak to me as a parish minister. I remember being over there one evening. So I asked her what her favourite hymn was. She said to me that her fondest memory ever of a Christian song was her father singing to her at her bedside as she was going to bed.
The hymn she remembered her father singing was based on the parable of the sheep lost in open country. Although the road be rough and steep, I go to the desert to find my sheep. Lord Sentamu, former Archbishop of York, is one of a small team that came up with the original order of service for the Queen's funeral. He says her knowledge of scripture was remarkable.
She knows the Psalms by heart and can recite them. So you can be in a conversation. One time, she was going through quite a trying period. We've been talking, and suddenly, I lift up my eyes to the hills. Whence cometh my help? My help cometh from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. And you knew, whatever difficulty she's going through, her anchor is in God.
And it was that anchor of her faith that once led the Queen to say this.
As dark as death can be, particularly for those suffering with grief, light and life are greater.
Aleem Makboul, BBC News.
Well, as we've witnessed, there's been an outpouring of emotion across the country. On the eve of the Queen's funeral, our home editor Mark Easton reflects now on the past 10 days of national mourning in the UK.
The certainties of a kingdom have been shaken, ruptured by the loss of its monarch and a key bridgehead to its past. Plans for these days have been in place for decades. Every feather and flag, every step and turn, choreographed in minute and meticulous detail.
The last 10 days have been about two distinct events: the passing of a queen and the making of a king. the transfer of authority is designed as an illustration of national competence. Britain showing its people and the world that even at a time of flux, it knows what it's doing.
There is purpose in the performance too, binding king and kingdom in the gold braid of reassuring custom. Questions over the future of the monarchy or the Union are answered with ceremonial conviction, echoes from ancient mists, albeit that much of the pageantry is a reinvention from the last century. But the respectful public response is real. The loss of a much-loved and venerable queen, a reminder of our own transience. Pilgrimages to palaces, the reverential ritual of flowers and flames, a communion with the sacred.
The last time I saw her, I saw exactly the same cheerfulness and confidence in her eyes as I imagined I'd seen at the coronation. We shall see whether the thread's been cut. King Charles could, after all, take the thread and knot it in a royal knot and say, on we go. That's what I hope he will do.
We have seen hostilities put to one side, a temporary truce perhaps, but an opportunity for healing too. Planned strikes suspended, disputes and rivalries postponed, Fulham and Chelsea, Alloa and Falkirk, derbies for another day.
The detailed plans for the accession always emphasised how the new king must be seen not only surrounded by the elite and titled, but among the ordinary people.
His first public act as king was to step from his Rolls-Royce outside the palace railings to meet and touch the gathered crowds, content to be kissed on hand and cheek by those he did not know. But when the dust settles, normality will return with the trials of real life. In facing those challenges, the country may have been strengthened by a period of reflection, a rare moment to think about who we are and who we want to be. Mark Easton, BBC News.
Let's take a final look now at Westminster Hall, where the Queen is lying in state. This has been the focal point of national mourning in these last 4 days, and hundreds of thousands of people have passed by the Queen's coffin for a few brief minutes to pay their respects, to say goodbye, and also to take part in this momentous national occasion. These are the last few hours in which people can file through the hall. The queue outside has now closed to newcomers. Those already in the queue will go on coming through the night until tomorrow morning at 6:30, when the lying in state ends and the final preparations for the state funeral begin. OK, let's take a look at the weather now. Here's Ben Rich. Ben.
Rita, we've seen a lot of different views of London tonight. This is a slightly different one. Beautiful lights over the city from one of our weather watchers in Wapping earlier on. All eyes, of course, turning to the capital for Her Majesty the Queen's state funeral tomorrow. I am hopeful that it will stay pretty much dry, but it will be rather cloudy, both in London and in Windsor. That cloud filtering in with this warm front. We have still got high pressure in charge. That means it will stay mostly dry, but there is quite a lot of cloud around to take us through tonight, producing some spots of light rain and drizzle. If you're under the cloud, a milder night. A little bit chilly in the southwest, the odd mist patch. Could be a touch of frost in the northeast of Scotland. And then for tomorrow, this band of cloud producing a little bit of patchy rain first thing, southwest Scotland, maybe northwest England, North Wales. And as that band of thicker cloud moves towards the capital, well, we could just see the odd shower breaking out into the afternoon. Equally, there's the chance of a few sunny spells. Best of the sunshine tomorrow, southwest England and also northeast Scotland. 13 to 19 degrees, the winds relatively light. And this band of thicker cloud with the odd spot of rain continuing to work eastwards during tomorrow evening. And then we look further ahead. Tuesday, again, a lot of cloud around, particularly in eastern parts, the odd spot of drizzle, but a better chance of seeing more in the way of sunshine out west. And after what's been a chilly weekend, it does start to feel just a little bit warmer. And then from midweek onwards, a bit of a change because we will see frontal systems pushing in from the northwest, bringing some outbreaks of rain. In fact, some of that rain could turn quite heavy for a time. So the increasing chance of rain through the week ahead tomorrow, for most of us, should stay largely dry. Rita.
Thank you, Ben. That is all from us at BBC News at 10. The news continues on BBC One, as now it's time to join our colleagues across the nations and regions for the news where you are. Good night.